Hi, Randall.
Hey, Henrik, how's it going?
Very good. And you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Can't complain.
How was your long weekend?
Not too bad, not too bad. I want to go see my dad, and I'm still out here. I'm actually gonna come back. I'm driving to my house here in like an hour. So,
Great.
yeah. I don't know if you've ever been to California, but California is some place that you kind of need a car.
I've been to San Francisco a couple of times. One time, just last November, to Los Angeles. But that's about it. Never more than a couple of days only. So I didn't take the time that is needed to visit it properly and drive around.
Good business. So I'm an LA boy through and through.
All right. Yeah, that city is so big.
History with the city of LA.
I was there at the CCS conference last November, and yeah, very impressive. I liked very much this view you have from the observatory over the city center, and basically everything until the seaside. What is the name of this observatory again? I forgot. Why did I forget this?
Henrik, I lost you there for a second.
Yeah, you were somehow you were gone for a few seconds. I said there was this. I went up to this observatory in LA where you have this beautiful view over the city until the sea.
The Griffith Observatory.
Exactly. Oh, that was spectacular, especially at nighttime. It was amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of nightlife out here in general. But yes, the Griffith Observatory is really nice.
Mm-mm. All right. Hey, Victor. So and all the others that joined in between. I suggest we maybe just start right away with the. I can also start my video. This makes it a little nicer. Hey. Yeah, maybe we go to after having discussed this developer machine for quite some time, I would like to move on to other parts of this diagram. And so maybe we can go to maybe the Git, the versioning control system, to see whether there are any particular threads and how they look like. Let me share my screen again so we have a look at the picture. Was anybody of you there last week during the work groups bi-weekly sync meeting by chance? No?
The end user one?
Yeah.
The one last Thursday, and I wondered whether there was any relevant feedback to share.
I'm going to say no because I don't recall anything.
All right.
Pretty good at remembering those types of things.
Good then. Perfect. It was a quick discussion of that then. All right. So so here we let me zoom a little bit more. So the Git, at least according to this architecture or the version control system, doesn't receive any third-party external components directly on it. I mean, they're downloaded, as you see, as indicated by those reddish arrows on the developer machine, of course, on the build system during the builds, or maybe build plugins, but I don't have anything that is really downloaded and run from the external on the versioning control system itself. So here we speak of one thing that is operated in-house. So this could be an enterprise GitHub system, or it could be just Git, or it could be Git plus Gerrit, and yeah, whatever. And yeah, these are probably the most prominent combinations and solutions. So maybe this is something that we can discuss before. Is there maybe a data flow that we are missing? Are there any from your experience? I mean, Git and Gerrit by itself are, of course, third-party open source components. Do they? I mean, then of course you would also have something like maybe commit hooks on Git. I'm not sure. This could be code snippets, right? Or maybe even plugins. I'm not sure. I'm not very familiar with this, with the architecture of Git in terms of Git extensions or plugins or the like. For Gerrit, I guess there are some. So maybe first question, do we miss here something on that front, a data flow?
Yes, GitHub Actions can be something which has a marketplace, right? And can be imported.
Yeah, but I'm not sure whether those GitHub Actions, so since we speak here of this in-house development environment, not one that is running in the cloud, I'm not sure whether those GitHub Actions from the marketplace can be really installed on the GitHub Enterprise system, for example, and whether there is any comparable marketplace or so for Git or Gerrit. I don't think so.
So are we just talking about where companies arbitrarily store things? Is that what we're talking about?
No, I think when we came up with this architecture, we kind of decided we focus on source code management systems that run in-house, and the most prominent being Git. And I wonder whether we are missing here a data flow. I do not want to cover really organizations storing their source code on the file system or so. I don't think that would be very meaningful. I'm also not sure whether we should spend so much time on looking at other versioning control systems. I mean, there are ones, but they seem either very more historic or commercial. And so I think Git is dominating the space so much that I think it's worthwhile focusing on this one in the first place. And so
the only use case, just for the record, Henry, the only use case where Git doesn't work is video game development, because their assets are freaking huge. You can't use it, but even with Git LFS, that's not. It doesn't. Just for the record, that's the only use case that I can think of as far as like a developer where Git does not lead. That's where you have. I think they use Mercurial or Perforce or whatever. Same thing. And that's because it does a better job of handling large assets. So depending on what you're trying to do, just like where you're at and what you're trying to develop, Git is very good with text-based files and smaller files, keeping track of a lot of really small files. The problem is that when you start getting to that larger size, yes, you have Git LFS, which is not like a complete part of Git. It's kind of an add-on. But nevertheless, it's still not a complete solution for most video game development workflows.
All right, but then this,
But it's still. But what I'm trying to say though is that Mercurial is very similar to Git, so a lot of this stuff should probably still apply.
All right, forgive me my ignorance, but is Mercurial open source or is this a commercial product?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, in many ways, it's actually superior than Git. The only reason that Mercurial didn't have the market share that Git did was because it wasn't developed by Linus. At least that's what the developer of Mercurial likes to blame it on. But but a lot of people do use it. It actually does have a fair use case. However, it is a privately owned thing. It is open source, but it's still like kind of commercialized in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So just throwing that out there, that if you're dealing with a project that has a lot of large files, you probably won't see Git. You'll probably see Mercurial. And like Git clone, all of that stuff actually works. Like it's very, very, very similar to Git, which is another reason why it was like, which one do we support? And it's kind of generally accepted that because Linus used Git in the kernel, that's why we use Git today. But I even think that GitHub might be compatible with Mercurial. I'm not 100% sure, but it is very similar to Git.
And I mean this Git LFS would you consider this being in fact kind of an extension or a plugin?
It is. If I'm not mistaken, that's something that GitHub brought to the table.
Okay.
I could be wrong. And just so you know, Henrik, one of the guys that I'm trying to bring to your meetings is Ian Webster, who's a colleague of mine at LF. He's our kernel security guy. So like he would be able to tell you like right up front, and he'll probably like he's very opinionated in that regard, but he'll be able to tell you up front. But from my understanding, yes, Mercurial is not something we can discount because community wise, there are people that use it. Okay. It is a very similar to Git, as I said. Sorry.
All right. No, that's perfectly fine. So then in fact, opinionated feedback is always very spicy and interesting. So that's looking forward to this.
He's a Debian maintainer and like a kernel maintainer. So he has a lot of that history stuff. He maintains all of the kernel security courses at LF. So yeah, he'd be an interesting take for him.
So one takeaway is that we should probably add this data flow for completeness to this architecture diagram, and so then maybe having this LFS as one example of an external open source component being running there. I wonder whether those I think they are called post-commit hooks, if I'm not mistaken, whether the post-commit hooks are a good example of something that kind of are external, can be external code, either just snippets, I guess, most of the times just snippets that are copied over into Git in order to be executed before the stuff, after the commit, before it is added to the remote branch.
Yep.
I guess.
I know, and a good example of that would be Linear. Linear is very popular right now. And that's what it does. It basically it's a project management software that works on Git's webhooks, GitHub's webhooks. So you could like manage GitHub through your PM now, which is what everyone's doing at LF now, or at LF training.
Which is Linear, right?
Yeah, linear.app is their website.
I think I've heard of them, but never had the came to use it.
One of the guys that we work with comes from Vercel, and apparently it's very widely used at Vercel. Like their whole business depends on Linear. So he was like, let's use Linear. And then like it caught on because now we're trying to like, make sure that we're not being, shall we say, as lax with timings and whatnot, trying to be nail down timings a little bit more. So yeah.
But so you say this is some project management software, okay.
But web developers use it mainly because it can automate like their workflow with like the right titles and everything. So yeah.
All right. So you would have the corresponding, I don't know, issue numbers and references and your commit messages and the like. Okay.
Correct. And then your manager can go in and like check how fast you're going and stuff like that. That GitHub has kind of a difficult part doing sometimes because more issue based. And they do have apps or project stuff too, but it gets real complicated. And we're also getting into real GitHub specific stuff that, for the record, the thing about GitHub, if I could be honest with you, from a community perspective, it's very hot and cold. Like you have people that like love GitHub, you have people that hate GitHub and love GitLab, which is equally as bad as GitHub. But yeah, you know,
No,
it's this.
I just wonder this how this integration looks like into both GitHub or Git. Is this just through those? These are just webhooks, right?
Well,
So
they have
this is
two integrations. They have webhooks, and then they have like what Abhishek was talking about, that they have kind of like an app that like gives them access per se. So
all right.
yeah,
Okay,
you need
so,
both.
so this would be a GitHub app that the company has to run locally, which is connecting to the GitHub Enterprise instance, and
No,
as such,
Linear runs the app. So all you really need to do is grant it permission to access the information in your instance of GitHub, whether that instance, and this is with GitHub Enterprise or not. And I have someone that we can confirm this with that works at GitHub. That's kind of our contact for these types of questions. But from my understanding, GitHub Enterprise is just a self-hosted instance of GitHub. Whether or not it's hosted by Microsoft or GitHub or you, from my understanding, the difference doesn't necessarily matter, because it's just a matter of where you're accessing the data. The app itself is hosted by GitHub/Linear.
Yeah, I think there are some limitations in terms of functionality for GitHub Enterprise. So I think it's not the same feature set being available for if you run it locally. And also I wonder whether the question whether you can connect to a remote GitHub application run by and operated by Linear app is maybe one of those restrictions. But,
yeah, if I could be honest with you, Henrik, there from a security perspective, the way it all comes together is really nice, but it really does make you wonder, like how does this actually go? Because it's one of those things where it's kind of like too nice, you know what I mean? So yeah. But it would be a great. I'm pretty sure that the app itself is hosted by Linear. I think most of it is where it accesses the information. And if I could tell you, I don't think it would really matter where you have that hosted, because all Linear basically does just connects the tickets to the actual GitHubs, and that's it. That's all it really does. Or the PRs.
Yeah, but it depends a little bit on the authorizations. So basically, in this hook, they are modifying just the commit message, or they also have access. I guess they also have access maybe to the files being touched, and so they could basically change.
No, I don't think they modify anything on the GitHub side. I think they use most of it from a point of view of you from a Linear side, because it connects the Linear ticket to the PR in the repo.
Okay. Well, this is the intended use case, but right. I think here we are talking about whether there are any threats to the integrity of the source code that is hosted on Git or GitHub Enterprise.
Correct. And I do think the permissions are very, I think it does need or just requests full permissions. So that concern is very valid.
So do you think it's sorry? Do you think it's good to review from last the developer machine, because there's a lot of things that's the same kind of problem, like virus, etc., will happen to the Git as well. Maybe we can at least define what is in scope and what is out of scope. This way, we don't have to find the same list of possible attacks vectors that's similar to development machine, but it's out of scope. That's one. And the second is my understanding Git. I mean, for version control, there are two types of version control. One is centralized. Basically, you use either GitHub or just your local copy, or you have a so-called distributed systems, whereas you probably use GitHub, but you make a clone of it, and so you develop actually locally. So yeah. So there was. probably those need to be separate, right? Distributed versus centralized.
Even though I think Git is a decentralized, right? You can have multiple remotes, and so there's no really. It's just a matter of how your workflow and your definition, whether you consider one of those being a central one or not. But I think in principle it would allow for a decentral approach. So it's just a configuration thing.
Just a note
right,
about the apps. So one of the features that an app, GitHub app has as a developer tool, allowing users to work with GitHub by signing into your GitHub app, which can then act on their behalf. So I guess that's kind of, I pasted the link to the GitHub apps definition.
Yeah, I think I think even there are two types of GitHub applications. The one, as you say, that is kind of impersonating the user from whom the GitHub app received a token or so. And then there is another type where the GitHub application has its own service user that is not linked to an end user account. But I'm not sure whether this makes, how much difference this makes in terms of, you know, threats on the for the organization. But let me just write this down. Service user account, and then in scope, out of scope.
If I could say something real quick, Hendrik, I think that we should maybe focus on Git itself, because I would also argue that every vendor probably, like, I know that GitHub was working on their own best practices guide. I don't know where that is, but I think that if you're going to end up using one of those third-party source code management tools, then to a certain degree, I would say refer to your vendor, like what your vendor is actually saying. And I think that we should focus on Git, because otherwise we're going to end up going down a lot of branches that really are somewhat vendor specific. Whereas if we say this is what you should do on Git, and then if you have a vendor replicate it in that setup with whatever your vendor tools are, I don't know. It seems more cohesive in my opinion.
Yeah, so in general, I sympathize much with focusing on Git, the open source version and control system, rather than addressing the problems that come with one of a commercial offering. So this is, I like this very much. I'm just wondering about the kind of the market, or the market presence of GitHub Enterprise, by whether this is justified just by the sheer number of users that you know makes it relevant.
If I could say this, Henrik, because we've in other working groups we've gone down that road. It's really hard to say, to be honest with you. Different area, or what it comes down to is different regions kind of prefer different softwares. So yes, GitHub Enterprise is more regions, but it's really hard to recommend one without like insulting the other, if you get my meaning.
Yes, I understand this very well. Yeah. So unless anybody else is objecting, I'm happy to just focus on Git and, you know, have all these commercial alternatives out of scope.
Yeah, I would suggest wherever possible, let's focus generically on the process and the general capabilities. And then if there's something unique that GitHub or GitLab offers that would be a particular interesting threat for us to examine, then we could do that. But let's try to be as generic and focus on the pure process as possible.
Yeah.
Probe, you know about the GitLab GitHub. I didn't know you were here. I was doing your job.
Man, it's our job.
Yeah, it's true.
All right. But to my knowledge, so other than that, in scope, out of scope. So I think a lot of the problems we have discussed indeed in the context of the developer machine also apply to, you know, the system running the version control system, such as there should be kind of a defined process for what you install, having vetted components and so forth. So there, a lot of those probably will also apply in the same way to the source code management system. It will be a little bit maybe different in terms of what kind of software is installed. These hooks, for example, or LFS. Do we have other examples for kind of extensions or so to Git?
Gitbomb, which is in the community.
I think there was also one. There's also one related to access control, right? I think there was this was
And by the
causing
way,
at some point a
Gitbomb
problem.
changed its name, but I don't know what they I forget what they changed it to.
Omniball.
I thought Gitbomb was sexier, but whatever.
Omniball.
Yeah, that Omnivore, correct. It's Omnivore now.
Like this, okay. Omniball. And then I can't remember the one for was for access control, I think. I think there was the one that caused a problem in the PHP Git repository where there was a supply chain attack like 2 years ago.
I think there's a Git server too, right?
Yeah, so that is 2020, I think. So I've never created a post commit hook on a Git server. Is this, you would just have kind of a script, right? That you deploy in some directory similar to the pre-commit hooks that you would have on a developer machine. You have these other extension points or directories for post commit hooks on the Git server, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Is there kind of a real marketplace for this, or are those exchanged more, you know, snippets on Stack Overflow, or is there more structured marketplace?
When I've seen it more used as bash shell scripts. They're usually just bash shell scripts that people write. Or just shell scripts. I guess they don't have to be bash, but they're just shell scripts.
Okay.
Yeah, so places like Stack Overflow would be most likely to have those things.
Yes.
Like, hey, I did a thing that after I do my push, it checks this or that, or so yeah, Stack Overflow would be more likely candidate.
Okay, so since that is out of scope, I move this a little bit to the bottom. Then in terms of types of version control systems, I wonder why and how to distinguish them.
What Victor said was correct. There is centralized, which is like SVN, if I'm not correct. So version is a type of centralized version control, and then you have distributed version control, which is where you find Git and Mercurial.
No, but that's I think CVS, right, from the old good old times. If this was a central versioning system, if I'm not mistaken. But I just wonder in what sense. So this will impact kind of the threats we are facing here in terms of consuming malicious component or code that threatens this organization running the whole stuff. Victor, do you have any?
I would say if it's centralized, you have like a machine that you got to worry about. And if it's decentralized, you go back to developer machines, because basically all the code is distributed amongst different developer machines. So my thought.
And ideally with centralized, there's a team of people. It's their responsibility to administer and protect it. but that, that is a very a choice target for an attacker, that essentially everything's in one spot. The distributed, we'd have to talk through how authentication and authorization to push things around works. But there's, I'm sure, other techniques of somebody sneaking malicious software in because of its decentralized nature.
Yeah, but I just wonder if realistically any organization internally has a decentral setup of Git where
for this model right here, the enterprise, probably not. You're talking about a bank or a retailer, or insurance company.
Isn't there a huge argument that like GitHub beats the purpose of Git because you do have like a centralized server? I think I've heard that argument before, right? Isn't this one of the critiques that GitHub has? Because if you're all pushing code to the same machine, then you're basically taking a distributed service and made it centralized.
Yeah.
Just saying, I'm just pointing that out. Because I don't know if you know this, Henrik, but Linus has very vocal issues with GitHub. Like the PR system, he thinks completely destroys Git.
Yeah, no, I haven't come across those complaints of Linus. All right.
Okay.
But yeah, I think your model of decentralized versus centralized is a great start. And if there's other things we could.
So my take here would be that bigger software development organizations probably go for a centralized versioning control system.
Yeah.
Would have been nice to have maybe John's feedback or some, at least from the bigger company I was working before it was also centralized. Yeah.
I would suggest maybe we bring this back to the end user working group with a couple questions, and you give them some homework saying, hey, we're looking at our model and we'd like to know, we think there are two styles of version control on an enterprise, and could you provide us feedback?
But I do think that we should stipulate that like having GitHub Enterprise on a single machine is centralized.
Yep.
Because I think some people get confused about that detail.
Okay, let me just ask at the section. For example, Git run on a dedicated server.
I would say dedicated instance or server or instance, maybe. Because, nowadays you can get instances anywhere.
And there could be orders of magnitude that may be a team or a group that's working on a platform might have their own, air quotes, centralized system, but that might not be part of an overall enterprise version control system. Think of like the Visual Studio model.
Yeah. So you basically have a few for bigger groups or teams within in such a development organization. Yeah, but All right. So then, in terms of scope, is this kind of going into the direction you had hoped for when raising the topic?
Yeah, not only that, maybe we can see what's out of scope for developer machines this way, because the same thing like virus, phishing attack and all that applies to the both developer machine and Git.
Yeah, the administrator could be victim of a phishing attack and have their credentials stolen, and therefore the attacker gets access to the enterprise repo.
Yeah, the same thing that's in scope or out of scope for developer machine probably applies to Git as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference, I wonder, because for the developer machine, if the developer is opening a phishing email and has some malware installed on his local machine, on that local machine is also where he's developing his code, to which then the virus or whatever malware had immediate access, while for the administrators of some central services or systems, this immediate access to the source code of the application developed is not there in the same way. So I wonder whether this is so comparable.
Well, if an attacker is going at an administrator and they understand they now have access to the repository, they might attack the like post-launch scripts or kind of do more system level things as opposed to manipulating the individual software components.
Okay, so they maybe could do some, I don't know, explore or play with vulnerabilities of the Git instance that this administrator has special permissions for. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but then it's still not the same thing, right?
No, it's not. Agreed. It's not modifying the software to make it malicious. Correct.
Okay. So I'd rather make this differences regarding.
And just to remind myself, we're kind of putting things like those administrator credential attacks kind of out of scope, right? We're focusing in on purely the changes to the code, making the code malicious or redirecting it somewhere naughty.
I think we are focusing on the consumption of malicious open source components.
Okay. So yeah, so the admin case is probably out of scope, and we should state that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we're also focusing on Git, then basically there should really be an admin, correct?
Well, I think that's a different exercise. Somebody should sit down and, I'm sure the Git folks have a threat model that kind of describes their attack surface and everything.
Fair.
And there should be kind of an administrator of Git, right? Why do you say there isn't? That's not so.
Well, because it's distributed. That's why I was saying. So,
there's an organization administrator. There is somebody's in charge at the top.
Exactly. If it is installed on a dedicated instance, that is per definition the central one, or this is how it is used. You also have somebody,
But I don't think you could do that with Git on its own. I think you would need an external software, because I think Git by itself comes as a distributed software. So so that's what I'm trying to say. So there wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't have, I don't even know if Git I think it does have organization level features, but beyond that, I don't think it has very much in terms of what GitHub has. You would need that GitHub element to have a centralized repository.
Yeah, I think that's it's just by convention, right?
But that's what I'm saying. By convention, that's a GitHub thing. That's not a Git thing. Because Git, if you see how the kernel uses Git, they don't use Git. They use GitHub as a mirror, but they don't use GitHub centrally. They use Git like it was intended, I think. And that's what I'm trying to say. They use it very differently with most organizations don't use it that way. And I'm not saying that it's fine if we say the GitHub on a dedicated, we could totally make that in scope, but I'm just saying that that's like a niche within a niche, if that makes sense. Which is
out of
the biggest
curiosity,
niche.
How do they? Well, it's an important niche. So then, how do they use Git differently?
If you go to kernel.org, they use Git. They use more they rely on PGP and stuff like that, and different types of security measures that are just different, and they are compatible with GitHub, but obviously GitHub gives you a lot more features, but a lot of those features are not fully part of Git, if that makes sense.
Well, and keep in mind that the kernel development is, the largest software development project on the planet, is open source, is very different than how a traditional enterprise potentially, they might borrow some of those techniques, but they're not going to follow exactly how the upstream kernel folks develop. And if
Do you
you're
know
in a company, you generally want to have things like business continuity and disaster recovery. So you don't want software randomly sprinkled across the organization. So if something happens, you've lost that ability to reinstall those things. So in an enterprise, you have different standards and controls.
I agree with that. I was gonna say, Krub, you don't know of any other projects that use like Git, like just 100% Git like that, do you? Just the kernel project?
No, I have a friend that is a security coach within a large bank here in the US. So he coaches development teams, and he's a developer by trade. So I can actually maybe see if I could drag him into this conversation to kind of see how is your organization doing these types of things, to kind of give us that perspective.
I was going to bring in Bean, which I think you know.
Yeah. Yep.
But Bean has his opinions.
I think last time Randall also mentioned we need a Windows expert as well.
That's true. I don't really do Windows that much, so I use Windows strictly for gaming.
All right. Okay, so then we basically said we focus on Git, which is running on one central instance. We excluded kind of attacks on phishing attacks and the like on administrators, even though they're different from, full stop. Okay, and then we came up with a couple of possible components that end up on the version control system by means of for extension purposes or the like. Okay, good.
Would it be an idea, Henrik, just out of curiosity, to maybe survey the end user group, maybe make a short survey of how people use Git, and then that way we could at least know what would be the most applicable thing to do? Because I don't disagree with you that most people probably use GitHub Enterprise on a dedicated instance. However, it's hard to separate because that's in a way that's its own animal, is what I'm saying. Like,
I would also disagree with your analysis that most people are using GitHub Enterprise on a dedicated instance. I know that GitHub is heavily, I've heard through the grapevine that GitHub is heavily pushing towards trying to get people onto their SaaS instances because they, it's easier for them to keep reoccurring revenue, sort of subscription model.
Yeah, it was the same thing happening for the company I worked on. They were operating GitHub Enterprise locally, and then they were moving gradually towards the hosted version.
But what I'm saying, would that be an idea to try to see how we can make this most applicable to people?
Yeah, definitely. I highlighted the corresponding note in the text, so maybe Krop, you can remember together with all of us to run a quick poll during the next end user work group meeting.
Sure thing. And I just reached out to my buddy Scott to see if he has some time maybe for an upcoming call to talk with us about what's going on currently within application security in an enterprise.
Great.
And about Git is not only the attack on the admin, it could be phishing attack to make the Git another Git looks like is the Git that developer need.
I'm not sure whether I understand what you're meaning. So you say
so the attack.
the attack would consist of redirecting the developer to basically a compromised Git, attacker-controlled Git, rather than the legitimate one, which is hosting the source.
Yeah, it may impersonate Git hosting service, so send like fraudulent Git-related emails to either just redirect to another Git service or try to expose his Git credentials. Those are not attack on the admin.
So this is something that would rather fit than to the developer machine again. But again, this is, I mean, would this be exercised through a malicious, component that you install, or how would you actually conduct this? I wonder.
It could be like a DNS attack, right? It could redirect to the to another Git, a wrong Git. In other words, it doesn't have to be attack on the developer machine itself.
Yeah, but then again, this would be a DNS server run within the corporation, right? And so this would require, I wonder just to what extent this is linked to the consumption of malicious open source components.
So
this is more kind of more the maybe the effect of an attack, or the not really the root cause. Or
I guess if this part I'm not sure. So like nowadays, with zero trust, right, there's tendency to do microsegmentation, like using service mesh. So if attacker get hold of the service mesh, could he just on that level redirect DNS traffic?
Yeah, but let me just help me writing this down. This is what you're saying?
Yeah.
All right. That's so the thread itself is not really on the materializing on the developer machine, right? But rather in your network. Good. All right. Where do we continue now? So from, I mean, on the developer machine, what we did is we listed all kind of ways on how malicious open third-party components and open source components could end up on a developer machine. I wonder whether we can do the same for the source code management system. We kind of said what components there are. How do they get there? They're typically, the setup we have discussed would be installed by by the administrator, right? Installed and configured. I think also post-commit hooks here require the administrator to become active to deploy those shell script. There's nothing that, you know, that developers themselves could kind of configure, install, extend on the central Git server.
I think that has to be configured, right? I mean, if the admin allowed, right, the members to configure that, then they can, I guess. It's not by default.
Okay, so then basically it boils down to
Policy, maybe.
Yeah, or just insecure configuration of the Git server that would allow anybody to install stuff there on, right? All right, so that is definitely one that is different from the developer machine, I think. I just go through the ones we have for the developer machine. Yeah, it seems to me that all those apply somehow also to whatever gets installed on this version control system, and probably also on the other systems later on.
Probably can make a difference because the Git machine is managed by admin. So anything that's need admin access, that's probably out of scope. Anything that doesn't need admin on a user level might be in scope for the Git as well.
So you mean everything that is an administrator and the administrator's control will be the same?
No, so for example, installing unauthorized software, right? So for developer who doesn't manage the Git server, he will not have admin access to install unauthorized software on the Git server. So that will be out of scope.
Well, yeah.
So anything that need administrator access on the Git server is out of scope for developer. Anything that doesn't need admin access on the Git server might be in scope.
Okay, let me just note this down. To the scope here. Yeah, well, there I would say components that require administrator access will face the same problems or threats as whatever the developers will install on their developer machines, right?
Yeah, component that require admin access on the Git server is basically the Git server admin's responsibility, is out of scope for this discussion.
Say problems, man. Yeah, problems is there. It's not a good phrasing, but does this capture you wanted to say, Victor?
Yeah.
So this is basically to limit this discussion to things that are different from the stuff happening on the developer machine. And so we kind of treat the developer having administrator permissions on his laptop in the same way that we treat the administrator having admin permissions on the Git system, right? Right. I don't have, yeah, I'm not sure, we almost reached the top of the hour. Is there anything else that you want me to add or that I was not documenting the way it should be? No. Okay, so this one requires really a little bit more cleaning up than the other ones. Okay, well then, unless there's anything else, I think I would finish here, if that is fine for you.
Yeah, I think this is a good stopping place. Great conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Speak you latest next week.
Excellent. Talk to you all soon. Cheers.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.